Hello, everybody. This is our social studies work for today, and it's a two-parter to finish up the this chapter, this lesson 3, or lesson 3. This is chapter 3, lesson 4. Excuse me, and this is the last two lessons are coming today and tomorrow, and we'll have some activities to enrich and really dig into this period of history because it's a very fascinating topic. And we're going to start talking about the Civil War. You can see it's one of our vocab words this week. And you can see right here, I'm going to underline it with yellow, right there, Civil War. And the Civil War, I'm sure you've probably heard of it. If not, then you will hear about it a lot more going forward in your schooling. But we're here to really examine how Indiana played a role in the Civil War. But before we start talking about that, I just want to give you some background on the Civil War before we start reading about it and then Indiana's eventual involvement. The Civil War started in the late 1800s. And there were a few things that built up to it, but there's one thing called the Missouri Compromise, and that was passed in 1820. And if you look at this map here, we have the key. It has the free states in the green, and then it has the slave states and territories in orange. All right. And if you'll notice, right down here, it has the Missouri Compromise line. Right here. Everything south of the Missouri Compromise was a slave state, except for Missouri itself right there, of course. And everything north, all those green states, were free states and territories. There were a lot of differences in the country at the time. Many people in the north had different beliefs from those in the south. And the most important difference was the opinion on slavery. The states in the north were not allowed to have slaves. Rightfully so. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible thing. A dark stain on our country's history, right? But it is something that happened. And many Northerners did not want the new territories that were going to be added, so like right over here, they didn't want this territory that was added to be slave states. They wanted them to be, they did not want the new territories to allow slavery. And the South disagreed with that. They wanted the enslaved workers to work their fields. So in 1820, the Congress made up this Missouri Compromise, and they drew that imaginary line there through the Louisiana Purchase territory. So slavery was outlawed through the North, but it was allowed in the South. After it was signed, there were 12 states that were slave states. Let me erase that. There were 12 slave states, and there were 12 free states. And you guys will delve much more into the Civil War as you go through your schooling. This is just Indiana history. U.S. history is next year, and you'll talk about it some more. It's an interesting period of time. So that's the background. That's kind of the build-up to the Civil War. Basically, there were some slave states. There were no slave states. Nobody agreed on it, and there was a war fought over it. Okay? And our vocab words that we're going to look at this week, and you'll be doing kind of a worksheet activity: abolition, states' rights, secede, Civil War, regiment, and militia. So what you're going to do is you're going to listen to me read. I'm just going to read the first 4 pages of our history textbook, and there's going to be some questions. There's going to be kind of a vocab sheet like we did with the last chapter, where we're going to really work with these vocab words. And then we'll read the last section tomorrow and really talk about Indiana and their involvement in that war. Hey guys. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to read pages 74 through 77 here together in your social studies workbook. What I want you to do is I want you to pay attention. I want you to really work on understanding what it is I'm talking to you. Watch the first part of this video where I kind of laid out the groundwork, give you a little background knowledge on the Civil War and talked through the vocab words. And we're going to look at a few of these vocab words, and then there's going to be a vocab activity you're going to work through. So it starts off here, Civil War and Indiana. Many Americans, including Hoosiers, fought in the Civil War. This is a company of African American soldiers from the war. As you learned, Indiana became a state in 1816. At this time, difficult issues divided the country. Many people in the North had different beliefs than people in the South. The most important difference was about slavery. These differences grew into a major conflict. The North and the South. Indiana was a free state in the North. This meant that it did not allow slavery. Other states, located in the South, were slave states. They did allow slavery. Some Northerners were in favor of abolition, or the ending of slavery. Okay, that's one of your vocab words. You're asked to look at that definition. Many Northerners did not want new Western territories to allow slavery. Southerners disagreed. They wanted enslaved workers to work in their fields. In 1820, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise. This bill drew an imaginary line through the Louisiana Purchase territory. Slavery was outlawed north of the line, but was allowed south of it. After the Missouri Compromise was signed, there were 12 slave states and 12 free states. Abolitionists, or people who thought slavery was wrong, hopefully everybody that is hearing this feels that way because it's one of the worst things in the world, looked for ways to help people escape slavery. In the 1790s, some of them had started the Underground Railroad. This was a secret network that helped enslaved people escape to free states and Canada. Information about routes was passed along through hidden messages and songs. Between 40,000 and 100,000 people used the system to gain their freedom. Many escape routes passed through Indiana. Thousands of people escaped slavery by traveling through Newport, a town in western Indiana. For 20 years, Levi and Catherine Coffin helped enslaved people gain freedom here. Once African Americans were free, some people worried they would not receive justice in the United States. They came up with a plan to move them to Africa. This movement, known as the Colonization Movement, started in 1816. The government and state set aside money and, in a few years, founded Liberia on Africa's west coast. By 1867, more than 13,000 immigrants had been sent there. Many opposed the movement, however, and it eventually came to an end. Lincoln becomes president. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He was part of the new Republican Party, which was against slavery. Southern states argued for states' rights, the idea that states had power and the right to decide important matters for themselves. This is a very hot-button issue, even this day and age, guys. States' rights have been talked about throughout the mask mandates during this pandemic. It's something that people still talk about to this day, 200 years later almost. Following Lincoln's election, Southerners viewed Lincoln's election as a threat to slavery, states' rights, and their way of life. Southern states began to secede or separate from the United States. That means they didn't want to be part of the U.S. as we know it today, guys. Soon, 11 southern states formed the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. Recall that a confederacy is a loose union of groups or states. That term confederacy was from the chapters or the lessons about Native Americans. President Lincoln did not accept the states seceding. He said the Confederate States were still part of the United States. He would do everything he could to keep the country united. He used the term union to describe a country he envisioned with liberty for all and no slavery. On April 12th, 1861, not long after Lincoln was sworn into office, Confederates fired shots on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. These first shots marked the beginning of the Civil War. A civil war is a war between different groups of people in the same country. Terrible thing, guys. Terrible thing. The war begins. This will be the last page we read, and then we'll work on stuff. There'll be an activity. The war begins. Both the Union and the Confederacy had strengths and weaknesses. The Union had a larger population and more factories. This meant more people could make supplies for the army. But most Civil War battles took place in the South. Union soldiers did not know the land as well as the Confederates did. The Union also had many railroads for moving troops and supplies, but the Confederacy did not have as many. Soon after the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter, the president called for 75,000 volunteers to fight for the Union. Hoosiers remained loyal to the Union and played important roles in the war. Oliver P. Morton was the governor of Indiana at the start of the Civil War. He strongly supported President Lincoln and the Union. When other states were trying to compromise in order to avoid a war, Morton told Lincoln he had 6,000 soldiers to help defend the Union. Within 2 weeks after the war began, 12,000 Indiana men volunteered to fight. Indiana formed 6 regiments. A regiment is a military unit usually made of several groups of soldiers. That's one of our vocab words, guys. For those of you military history buffs, there you go. Governor Morton needed officers to lead the volunteers. He selected Lew Wallace and Benjamin Harrison, both lawyers in Indiana, to lead the volunteers into battle. Important Civil War battles. Most people thought the war would end quickly, but they were wrong. Fighting lasted for 4 years and spread across 23 states. In all, soldiers fought as many as 10,000 battles. Union troops cried, "On to Richmond!" as they advanced on Confederate forces in July 1861. The Confederate soldiers were camped in Virginia, close to the country's capital in Washington, D.C. Lincoln and many other Northerners believed this would be an easy win for the Union Army. They also thought it would clear the path to Richmond, where Union troops could capture the Confederate capital and quickly end the war. However, the inexperienced Union soldiers were no match for the determined group of Confederate soldiers. The First Battle of Bull Run was a major victory for the South. All right, guys. You have about all of your vocab words in that first section. The only one that's not in there is militia. But I want you to complete the activity where you're answering some questions using these vocab words. And then tomorrow we're going to look at the next part of this chapter or of this lesson.